Imagine the most hated unit of the Second World War. Not the elite, not the disciplined, rather, the one even other SS men whispered about with disgust. A formation built from prison cells and back alleys, turned loose on civilians and partisans, rewarded for cruelty because cruelty was the point. Now imagine its commander, a decorated First World War veteran, a convicted sex offender, a man protected by powerful patrons, and unleashed on occupied Europe. For years after 1945, rumors insisted he slipped away in the chaos, vanished into South America, died an old man under another name. But the paper trail, the eyewitnesses, and later forensics point to a different ending. He was arrested by French forces on May 7, 1945, and by early June he was dead in custody. Tonight we trace how Oskar Dirlewanger built his evil brigade, how it operated, and how his story ended without myth, without excuses, and without mercy. Ready? Oskar Paul Dirlewanger was born into a Germany that raised boys on war stories and medals. By 19, he was in trenches, earning the Iron Crosses he would later flaunt. The defeat of 1918 didn't tame him. Like many embittered veterans, he drifted through the violent politics of the Weimar years, joined the Nazi Party early, and learned how to lean on connections. But the story turns darker in 1934 when a court convicted him of a sexual offense involving a minor. He went to prison. Even for future SS men, that stain didn't wash off easily. What changed his path wasn't repentance, it was a patron. Gottlob Berger, an influential organizer in the SS, saw use for a man like him. After a spell in a concentration camp as a so-called protective prisoner, Dirlewanger found himself pulled upward again into a new kind of unit the regime was quietly experimenting with. Punishment formations that could be spent like ammunition. In 1940, the experiment became reality. The euphemism on the paperwork was tidy, Sonderkommando Dirlewanger. The reality was not. At first, it drew poachers and forest criminals, men supposedly handy with rifles and tracking. Then came hardened offenders, then political prisoners, then anyone the SS wanted to throw into a uniform and aim at a village. It was a unit built to do what regular formations either could not stomach or could not admit. Anti-partisan warfare that blurred, often obliterated, the line between fighter and civilian. If you've heard the term Bandenbekämpfung, bandit fighting, you know the script: roundups, torched barns. Pacification reports with neat columns for enemy dead that often meant peasants and children. In the language of occupation, this was order. In the lived experience of Belarus, the Eastern General Government, and later Warsaw, this was terror with a rubber stamp. Listen to how it worked. Intelligence would flag a hamlet as bandit suspect. The Dirlewanger men moved in at dawn, often drunk or about to be. One ring sealed off the area, another combed through houses, cellars, haylofts. Men were separated, women and the elderly herded into barns or fields. A single gun hidden in a wall could become an alibi for a massacre. Bodies were counted twice, once for the report, once for the photographer if higher command wanted proof of zeal. The report spoke of quotas met, survivors spoke of names erased, and yes, other units committed atrocities. But the Dirlewanger formation made atrocity its brand, its method, its currency with superiors. When commanders needed results, they sent criminals and told themselves the moral debt could be paid later. By 1942 and 1943, the unit was operating in Belarus, participating in sweeps, with names that sounded like factory schedules: Cottbus, Erntefest, Triangle. The tactic was always similar: encircle, burn, deport, kill. How many civilians died at their hands? No honest historian will give you a single number. Records were destroyed, victims were not recorded with dignity, and responsibility overlapped with police units, collaborationist battalions, and regular army detachments. But the pattern is unmistakable. Wherever Dirlewanger's men were sent, the proportion of dead non-combatants rose sharply, and inside the unit, rot kept pace with violence. Discipline was mocked, looting was routine, alcohol was policy disguised as rations. When you recruit from prisons, you get what you ask for. Then came Warsaw, August 1944. A city in revolt, desperate to free itself before the Red Army arrived, the Germans responded by declaring a city of nearly 1 million souls a battlefield and a lesson. Dirlewanger's brigade, by now swollen with new drafts of criminals, men pulled from camps, even some SS misfits who had failed elsewhere, was thrown into the Wola district. The killing there, over a handful of days, left tens of thousands of civilians dead. Were they the only perpetrators? No. Other infamous formations like the Kaminsky Brigade played their part. But Dirlewanger's name attached itself to Wola because of the method: house-to-house executions, hospitals stormed, patients shot on cots. The brigade was promoted in paper strength, praised in cables, and yet every extra stripe only made it more poisonous. Ask yourself, what does it do to a force when promotion comes as a reward for mass murder rather than military skill? If there's a paradox in this story, it's here. The more Dirlewanger delivered results the regime wanted, the less effective he became as a soldier. Drunk units break under pressure, stolen boots fall apart in mud. Men who treat civilians as prey are not reliable under fire. In late 1944 and early 1945, as the Reich's borders shrank and the Wehrmacht tried to stitch together defensive lines with whatever it had, the brigade began to look less like a weapon and more like a liability. It took heavy losses, it pulled back, was moved, renamed, patched with new convicts. Dirlewanger himself was wounded more than once. He was not the iron-nerved commander of propaganda posters. He was a limping, scarred man in a threadbare uniform, clinging to rank because rank kept him safe until it didn't. What does justice look like at the edge of defeat? In May 1945, southern Germany was a landscape of surrenders and reprisals, refugees and war crimes units trying to triage the past. Dirlewanger, injured, depleted, fleeing, made his way into Württemberg. Villagers had heard the stories, some had seen what his men did far from home. The French First Army was sweeping through the region, taking custody of prisoners, setting up holding points in small towns and village jails, asking local officials for lists of wanted men. In one such place, Altshausen, a name appeared that caused a stir. Oskar Dirlewanger. Could it really be him? Before we answer that, pause and consider the stakes. If a man like this were to vanish into the fog, what would that say about 1945 as a moment of moral accounting? Would the war's ending be just another curtain drop, or could it close some stories decisively? Witnesses do not agree on every detail of what happened next. Some say he was recognized by former forced laborers, others by French soldiers who knew the lists. Accounts of beatings circulate, raw, plausible, but not provable in every detail. What the sources do agree on is simple and stark. He was taken into custody alive, and in a matter of weeks he would be dead. The truth is, the end of Oskar Dirlewanger's life is both clearer and murkier than the legends. Clearer because we have dates, places, and later forensic work that point to a body in a grave under his name. Murkier because the precise chain of custody and the condition of his body when it was buried were recorded by men with other priorities, securing order, processing thousands of prisoners, trying to keep food flowing and violence contained. If you're expecting a courtroom, a verdict, a careful transcript, this is not Nuremberg. This is a small jail in rural Württemberg with too many prisoners and too few guards. And yet even there, history left a paper trail. Entries in a ledger, a note from a local official, a burial record. Think about the psychology of rumors. For men like Dirlewanger, escape myths are not just fantasies. They are a mirror of our fear that evil can always slip away. He got out. He paid a surgeon. He traded gold for silence. In the 1950s, those stories spread because they served needs. Some former Nazis wanted to believe a comrade had beaten the odds. Some survivors heard the rumors and felt cheated because official justice seemed so slow and partial. But history is not obliged to satisfy anyone's hopes, only to follow evidence. And evidence in this case takes us to a grave that would be opened 15 years later. Inside, examiners would find what they were looking for. We will go there. We will walk into that autopsy room, we will read the forensic notes, and we will weigh them against the eyewitness accounts. But before we do, let's see where his brigade went in those final weeks and why the story of its disintegration matters for understanding the man's end. Because the last thing a criminal commander wants is survivors who can testify, and the last thing a state that weaponized criminals wants is a neat list of names and dates that lead back to the top. So the collapse of the Dirlewanger unit is not just a military footnote, it's part of the structure of evasion, silence, and in this case, an ending that seems almost too ordinary for a man whose name became shorthand for atrocity. If a monster dies in a village jail, does the world hear it? Or does it take 15 years, a spade, and a forensic report to make the sound carry? By June of 1945, the war in Europe was over, but for Oskar Dirlewanger, it was the final act. Witnesses place him in French custody at Altshausen, a small town in Württemberg. The records indicate he died between the 5th and the 7th of June. How? That depends on which account you read. Some describe a sick, wounded man who succumbed to his injuries and neglect. Others insist he was beaten to death by guards or former forced laborers who recognized him. Both versions are plausible. What unites them is that his end came not with a trial, not with a gallows, but with a battered body laid in a local graveyard. Now here is where the story takes its twist. Almost immediately, rumors sprouted that he had escaped. Perhaps it was too unsatisfying, too anticlimactic, that a figure of such infamy could simply wither away in a rural cell. Stories circulated that he bribed guards, that he slipped across borders, that he reinvented himself under another name in South America. And why not? Other Nazis did. Mengele, Eichmann for a time. The idea that Dirlewanger had done the same spread because it fed both hope and fear. Hope among his former comrades that their commander had survived. Fear among survivors that justice had again been denied, but documents stayed, burial records, a plot in Altshausen. And then in 1960, German officials reopened the case. The grave was exhumed. Forensic analysis was carried out on the remains. The conclusion was straightforward. The body was indeed Oskar Dirlewanger. Scars and injuries matched. The dental records aligned. The conspiracy theories that had fueled a decade and a half of speculation collapsed under the weight of physical evidence. He hadn't vanished into Argentina or Spain. He had rotted in German soil since 1945. For a man who once wielded terror across occupied Europe, that ending feels almost too quiet. But what about the brigade itself? Here the story becomes just as important because institutions leave legacies. By the war's end, the Dirlewanger formation was a shadow of itself. Casualties, desertions, executions, it bled out on the Eastern Front and in the final battles in Germany. Some survivors melted back into civilian life, concealing their past. A few were tried and punished, but many were not. The Nuremberg trials focused on the architects, the policymakers, the top brass. Units like Dirlewanger's were evidence, yes, but not always the subject of direct justice. It is one of the bitter truths of history. Not all perpetrators faced the dock. Some fade into the anonymity of the post-war years. So what do we do with this knowledge? First, we strip away the myth. Oskar Dirlewanger did not cheat history. He did not escape. He died under guard, his body buried in the earth of the country he claimed to serve. Second, we recognize that his unit was not an anomaly from Mars. It was a logical outcome of a regime that believed brutality was a tool, that saw entire populations as expendable, that empowered criminals when ordinary soldiers flinched. To study Dirlewanger is not to gawk at a freak show. It is to look into the machinery of the Third Reich and see how far it would go when morality was abandoned. Think about it. When you unleash men with nothing to lose, when you reward them for slaughter, when you make sadism into a job description, what happens? You get a brigade whose name becomes a curse. You get battle reports that are lists of atrocities. You get commanders like Dirlewanger, whose only qualification for promotion was his willingness to do what others found unthinkable. And in the end, you get collapse, chaos, and a grave in a small German town. But let's not stop there. Consider the wider lesson. Evil rarely arrives in jackboots and fanfare. It often comes in the form of institutions, decisions, policies. The Dirlewanger Brigade was not a spontaneous mob. It was authorized, supplied, praised in official communiques. That's the uncomfortable truth. Systems of power built it, tolerated it, and used it. Which forces us to ask, what systems today reward cruelty? What institutions protect those who should face consequences? History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes, and ignoring those rhymes is how we allow smaller evils to grow unchecked. By the late 1940s and 1950s, survivors of Warsaw and Belarus still spoke his name with venom. In Poland, in Belarus, in Russia, the memory of his brigade's atrocities shaped the way entire generations viewed the German occupation. And yet, in Western Europe, Dirlewanger was almost a footnote until the rumors of his survival reignited public curiosity. That's why the 1960 exhumation mattered. It wasn't just about one corpse. It was about proving to the world that yes, this man was dead. The fear could be put to rest. The rumors silenced. Justice had not been complete, but at least in this one case it was final. Justice, though, is not the same as closure. For every grave, there were villages erased. For every confirmed death of a perpetrator, there were thousands of victims whose names were never recorded. That imbalance is what lingers. It's what makes the study of history more than just collecting dates and ranks. It forces us to confront the human cost, the silences, the missing, and it forces us to keep telling these stories, not as sensational tales, but as warnings. So I ask you, was the death of Oskar Dirlewanger alone, disgraced, beaten or broken in a French-run cell enough punishment for what he unleashed? Can any ending balance the scales against tens of thousands of innocent lives? Or does the real punishment lie in the fact that his name, decades later, is remembered not with honor, but with horror? As we close this chapter, remember that the Dirlewanger Brigade was more than a grotesque footnote. It was a mirror showing the extremes of what the Nazi system allowed and encouraged. Its commander did not live to boast of survival. His remains, dug up in 1960, proved the point. There was no escape. For once, myth gave way to fact, and fact tells us that monsters do die, but only if systems are torn down with them. If you found this story important, share it. Leave a comment. What do you think? Was his end too easy or fitting? And don't forget to subscribe for more hidden histories of the Second World War. These are stories that matter, stories that echo, and stories that must never be forgotten.